The scream that ripped through the backyard sent ice-cold fear through my veins. I had only turned my back for a moment, just a second to set down my gardening tools and wipe the sweat from my brow. But in that instant, I heard it. A shrill, terrified cry, the kind that makes a parent's heart stop. "Mommy!" Spinning on my heels, I saw her. Emma, my 2-year-old, standing frozen near the flower bed, her tiny body stiff as a board. But my eyes weren't on her. They were on the thing coiled just inches from her bare feet, its dark, scaly body tensed to strike. A snake. And not just any snake. It was thick, mean-looking, and far too close to my baby girl. I couldn't move fast enough. I couldn't reach her in time. Then, out of nowhere, Duke came charging in. Duke, our German shepherd, had always been a good dog, loyal, protective, and smart as a whip. But that day, he was more than a good dog. He was a hero. He launched himself at the snake with a ferocity I had never seen before. His body moved in a blur, a mix of fur and muscle, as he threw himself between Emma and the danger in front of her. The snake recoiled, hissing, and struck. Duke barked, snapping his jaws at the reptile, his teeth clamping down in one swift motion. A furious battle ensued, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The snake twisted, coiling around Duke's leg, but he didn't back down. He bit, shook, and tossed the creature away, sending it flying into the bushes. I ran, scooping Emma into my arms as tears streamed down my face. She was safe. She was okay. But then I turned to Duke. He stood there, panting, his body trembling. His front paw lifted slightly off the ground. And then, he wobbled. My heart clenched. Something was wrong. "Duke!" My voice cracked as I knelt beside him, running my hands over his fur. He let out a soft whine, his ears drooping as he licked Emma's hand, as if to tell her everything was all right. But everything was not all right. A closer look revealed the horror. 2 small red puncture wounds on his leg. My stomach dropped. The snake had gotten him. No, 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 no. My hands trembled as I touched the wound. Duke's eyes met mine, still full of that same love and devotion, but I could see the pain setting in. His breathing was quick, his body weakening. "Mom, what happened?" My husband, Jason, ran out onto the porch, his face pale as he took in the sight of Duke and the sobbing child in my arms. "The snake! Duke, he got bit!" I gasped, my voice frantic. "We need to get him to the vet now." Jason didn't waste a second. He scooped Duke up into his arms as I carried Emma, and we bolted for the car. The drive to the vet's office felt endless. Every red light an eternity. Every second ticking by like a lifetime. "Hold on, boy," Jason murmured, stroking Duke's head as he lay in the back seat. "Just hold on." By the time we screeched into the vet's parking lot, Duke's breathing was shallow. My chest ached as I ran inside, shouting for help. The vet techs moved fast, rushing Duke to the back as I stood there, frozen in the waiting room. Emma clung to my leg, her tiny hands gripping my jeans. Jason wrapped his arm around me, his jaw tight. Minutes felt like hours. Every time the door swung open, I held my breath, waiting for news. Finally, the vet, Dr. Anderson, emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. His face was serious, but calm. "We've stabilized him," he said. "The venom was fast-acting, but you got him here in time. We gave him anti-venom, and he's responding. It's going to be touch and go for the next few hours, but he's a fighter." Relief crashed over me like a tidal wave. I covered my face with my hands, letting out a sob as Jason squeezed my shoulder. Emma, sensing the shift, looked up at me with wide eyes. "Duke's okay?" she asked, her voice small. I nodded, wiping my tears. He's going to be okay, baby. Dr. Anderson hesitated. There's something else, he said, glancing between us. When we were treating him, we found something unexpected. I stiffened. What do you mean? The vet exhaled. I think you should come see for yourselves. Jason and I exchanged worried glances before following him into the back. My heart pounded in my ears as we stepped into the treatment room where Duke lay, hooked up to an IV. He lifted his head slightly when he saw us, his tail giving a weak wag. Hey, buddy, Jason murmured, kneeling beside him. Dr. Anderson motioned toward Duke's side. While shaving the area to check for additional bites, we found this. I followed his gaze, and my stomach turned to ice. There, just beneath Duke's fur, was a scar. A long, jagged scar running down his side, hidden beneath the thick coat we had always admired. I frowned, confusion twisting in my chest. That wasn't there before, I whispered. Jason's face was grim. What does it mean? Dr. Anderson studied us for a long moment before answering. I don't know where Duke came from before you got him, but this scar, it's surgical, and whatever was done to him, it wasn't routine. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Duke had been a rescue, found abandoned as a puppy and given to us by a friend. We had never questioned his past, never even thought to. Now, I was beginning to wonder. What are you saying? Jason asked, his voice low. Dr. Anderson hesitated, then said, I think someone did something to him, and I don't think they ever wanted him to be found. The room went silent. My eyes dropped to Duke, who lay there, looking at us with nothing but love in his tired eyes. He had saved our daughter. He had risked everything to protect us. And now, it seemed, he had a story of his own, one we had never even thought to ask about. And whatever that story was, it was far from over. Back home that evening, we couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Anderson had told us. As Duke rested on his bed in the living room, a soft blanket draped over his side, Jason and I sat at the kitchen table, speaking in low voices. I just don't get it, Jason said, running a hand through his hair. Where would he have gotten a scar like that? I shook my head, my mind racing. He was so young when he came to us, barely more than a puppy. I never thought there might be something we didn't know about him. We both looked over at Duke, who was asleep now, his chest rising and falling steadily. Emma sat beside him on the floor, carefully placing one of her favorite stuffed animals, an old rabbit missing one ear, near his paws. It's just so strange, Jason said quietly. Why would someone operate on a puppy like that and then just abandon him? It was a question that neither of us could answer. And the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. Duke had always been such a good, loyal dog, but now I was starting to wonder if there was more to his story than we knew. As the days passed, Duke began to recover. He regained his strength little by little, and before long he was back on his feet, wagging his tail and following Emma around the house like he always had. To anyone who saw him, he was just a regular, happy dog. But Jason and I couldn't shake the questions that Dr. Anderson's discovery had raised. It wasn't until a week later that we finally decided to do something about it. Jason was the one who brought it up first, as we were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun set behind the trees. Maybe we should try to find out where he came from, he said, his voice low. I mean, really find out. Maybe someone out there knows something about him. I nodded slowly. It's worth a shot. I don't know how we'd go about it, though. We don't even know where he was before our friend brought him to us. Jason leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Maybe we could start with the rescue group. See if they have any records or anything. It seemed like a long shot, but it was a start. The next morning, while Emma was at preschool, I called the rescue group that had originally placed Duke with our friend. I explained the situation as best as I could without sounding too far-fetched, mentioning the scar and our curiosity about his past. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic, but said their records didn't go back very far. Still, she offered to check with the person who had originally taken Duke in. A few days later, I received a call back. The woman from the rescue group had tracked down the volunteer who had found Duke. She gave me a phone number and a name. Susan. I called Susan that evening. She was friendly and seemed genuinely excited to talk about Duke. "I remember him," she said right away. "He was one of the sweetest puppies we ever had come through." When I asked if she knew anything about his background, there was a pause. "You know," she said slowly, "I don't know much. He was found near a roadside rest area, just wandering around. He was so tiny, we didn't think he'd been on his own for very long. No collar, no microchip, nothing." "Was he injured when you found him?" I asked. "No, not that I remember. He looked healthy, a little scared and hungry, but no obvious injuries." "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then told her about the scar. "We didn't notice it until recently. The vet said it looked surgical." There was a long silence. "I don't know what to tell you," Susan said at last. "When we got him, he seemed fine. But if you say there's a scar, well, maybe something happened to him before we found him." It was a dead end, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. If Duke had been operated on before he was found, someone out there knew why. Jason and I spent the next few weeks following every lead we could think of. We called other rescue groups, checked local vet clinics, and even posted on community message boards. But no one seemed to know anything about Duke's past. It was as if his life before that rest stop was a blank slate. Despite the lack of answers, life went on. Duke was back to his old self, romping around the yard and chasing squirrels. Emma adored him more than ever, and it was clear that he loved her just as much. Whatever his past had been, it hadn't changed who he was now. A loyal, loving part of our family. But the questions lingered. And then one morning, something unexpected happened. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when I noticed Duke sitting by the back door, his ears perked up. He let out a low, rumbling growl, something I'd never heard from him before. I walked over to see what had caught his attention. Outside, at the edge of the yard, a man stood just beyond the fence. He was tall and thin, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching the house. My stomach tightened. "Jason," I called, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Come here." Jason appeared in the kitchen doorway, and I pointed to the man outside. "Do you see him?" Jason's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the window. "Yeah. What's he doing?" "I don't know," I said. "He's just standing there. Duke's been growling at him." Jason frowned. "I'll go see what he wants." "No," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "Don't go out there. Just call the police." He hesitated, then nodded. We both watched as the man lingered for another moment before turning and walking away down the street. I couldn't explain it, but something about him made my skin crawl. When the police arrived, the man was long gone. They took a report and promised to keep an eye on the area, but there wasn't much they could do. Still, the incident left me on edge. Who was that man? And why had he been watching our house? As the weeks went by, I tried to put it out of my mind. But every now and then, I caught myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see that stranger standing there again. Duke seemed to sense my unease. He stayed close, his eyes always scanning the yard whenever we were outside. It was as if he knew something wasn't quite right. One evening, after putting Emma to bed, Jason and I sat on the couch, the TV on, but the sound muted. I turned to him, my voice low. "What if that man had something to do with Duke's past?" I said. Jason looked thoughtful. "You mean, what if he knew something about where Duke came from?" I nodded. It just seems so strange. The scar, the man at the fence. What if they're connected? Jason sighed. "It's possible, but we don't have any proof, and without proof, there's not much we can do." He was right, of course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important. Duke's story wasn't just a mystery, it was a puzzle, and I was determined to find the missing piece. Another month passed, and life settled into a routine once more. The stranger at the fence had not returned, and Duke was as lively as ever. On the surface, it seemed that our lives had returned to normal, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. One morning, after dropping Emma off at preschool, I decided to stop by the local library. It had been years since I'd set foot inside, but I remembered their archives had a section dedicated to local news and community events. Maybe, just maybe, I could find some mention of a dog fitting Duke's description, something that might give me a clue about his past. The librarian, a friendly woman named Mrs. Riley, smiled when I asked for help. "You're looking for old news articles about a German shepherd?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Any particular time frame?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "He was found as a puppy about 5 years ago, so I'd say anything from around then." Mrs. Riley nodded and led me to a row of computers. "Our archives are digitized. You can search by keywords, dates, or even locations. If you need any assistance, just let me know." "Thank you," I said, settling into a chair. I typed in the first few terms that came to mind. German Shepherd, puppy, rescue, abandoned. I sorted the results by date and began scrolling. Most of the articles were about local shelters, adoption events, or lost and found pet notices. But then one headline caught my eye. "Local vet clinic seeks owner of injured German Shepherd puppy." I clicked on the article, my heart pounding. It was dated about 5 years ago, around the time Duke had been found. The article described a young German Shepherd puppy that had been brought into a nearby vet clinic with a severe injury. The clinic had treated the pup and put out a public notice, hoping the owner would come forward. When no one did, the clinic eventually transferred the puppy to a rescue organization. Could this be Duke? The timing matched, and it would explain the scar. I jotted down the clinic's name and address, determined to pay them a visit. The next day, I found myself standing in front of the vet clinic. The building was small and unassuming, with a modest sign that read Cedar Valley Animal Hospital. I pushed open the door, and the smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of conversation greeted me. "Hi there," said a cheerful receptionist. "How can I help you today?" I explained why I was there, and she nodded. "Give me just a moment. Let me see if we still have any records from that time." She disappeared into the back, and I waited anxiously in the lobby. A few minutes later, she returned with a file folder in hand. "Here we go," she said. "This is the record for the German Shepherd puppy we treated about 5 years ago. It says here that he was brought in by a Good Samaritan who found him near a wooded area off County Road 27. He had a laceration on his side, likely from some kind of sharp object. We performed surgery, and he made a full recovery." I nodded, my mind racing. "Does it say who found him?" She shook her head. "No, just that it was someone who didn't leave a name. They dropped him off, covered the initial cost of the surgery, and asked us to find him a good home if the owner didn't come forward." "Do you have any idea where he came from?" I pressed. Did the person mention seeing anyone else around or anything unusual? I'm sorry, there's no additional information here, she said. But if you'd like, I can give you a copy of the record. Maybe it'll help you piece things together. I thanked her and took the copy, my hands shaking slightly. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but feel both relieved and frustrated. I had found a solid lead, but it still left so many questions unanswered. Who had brought Duke to the clinic? What had caused the injury in the first place? And why was no one willing to come forward? When I got home, Jason was waiting for me in the kitchen. I spread out the documents on the table and told him everything I had learned. He listened intently, his brow furrowed. So, someone found him near a wooded area and brought him to the clinic, he said, rubbing his chin. But they didn't leave any contact information. Exactly, I said. It's like they didn't want to be found. Jason looked at the file again, then back at me. What do you want to do now? I thought for a moment, then said, I want to go to that wooded area. Maybe there's something there. Something that might give us more answers. All right, he said, his voice calm and steady. We'll go together. But let's be careful. If someone didn't want to be found, they might not want us poking around. We planned to go the following weekend, when Emma could stay with her grandparents. On Saturday morning, we packed some snacks, bottled water, and a flashlight, just in case. Duke seemed to sense our determination. He wagged his tail eagerly as we loaded up the car, his energy infectious. The drive to County Road 27 was quiet, the landscape gradually shifting from suburban neighborhoods to open fields and dense patches of forest. We parked along the shoulder near the area mentioned in the file, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. The woods were thick and quiet, the only sounds coming from birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. We followed a narrow dirt path, our eyes scanning the surroundings for anything unusual. Duke trotted ahead, his nose low to the ground, occasionally pausing to sniff. After about 20 minutes, we came to a small clearing. There, amid the fallen leaves, was an old, dilapidated wooden shed. The structure was barely standing, its roof sagging and the walls covered in moss. Jason and I exchanged glances, then approached cautiously. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shrugged. "I'm not sure, but it's worth checking out." We walked around the shed, noting the broken windows and the faint scent of decay. Duke stopped at the door, sniffing intently, then let out a low whine. I placed a hand on his head, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Jason pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the otherwise silent woods. Inside, the shed was empty, save for a few rusted tools, a stack of old newspapers, and a pile of crumpled blankets in the corner. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the space. "What's that?" I pointed to the blankets. There was something underneath them, a small, weathered box. I carefully moved the blankets aside and picked up the box. It was metal, with a heavy padlock securing it shut. Jason frowned. "You think this is important?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But why would it be here, hidden under blankets, in a place like this?" We carried the box back to the car, our minds racing with possibilities. Once we got home, Jason used a pair of bolt cutters to break the rusted lock. The box creaked open, revealing a few faded photographs, a yellowed envelope, and a small leather-bound notebook. The photos showed a man in his late 20s or early 30s standing next to a German shepherd that looked just like Duke. In one picture, the man and the dog were standing in front of a house. Another photo showed them at what appeared to be a training facility, with obstacle courses in the background. The envelope contained a letter, its handwriting neat but hurried. I read it aloud, my voice trembling. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, I can only hope that you have come to this place with good intentions. The dog in these photos is a very special animal. He was trained for purposes I deeply regret, and I was forced to leave him behind when I could no longer continue that line of work. I never intended to abandon him, but I had no other choice. If you have him now, please take care of him. He deserves a better life than the one I gave him. He is loyal, intelligent, and brave. I have no doubt he will repay your kindness tenfold. Sincerely, a friend. Jason and I sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in my hands. The notebook, when we opened it, was filled with detailed training notes, commands, and routines. It described drills that sounded like they were meant for military or police work. Duke nudged my leg with his nose, and I looked down at him. He gazed back at me with those same loving eyes, as if to say, "I'm here now. None of that matters anymore." But it did matter. This letter, these photos, they were pieces of the puzzle. They told us that Duke hadn't just been abandoned. He had been left behind on purpose, by someone who clearly cared about him but couldn't keep him. As I stroked Duke's fur, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Relief that we finally knew a bit more about his past. Anger that someone had put him through such a difficult start in life. And gratitude that despite it all, he had found his way to us. The days following our discovery of the letter were a whirlwind of emotions. Duke, blissfully unaware of the significance of what we had found, carried on as usual, trotting through the yard, chasing after Emma, and curling up at my feet in the evenings. Yet for Jason and me, every look at him carried a new weight. We pored over the photos and the letter repeatedly, trying to glean any more information from them. Jason even examined the notebook with a magnifying glass, as if the details of Duke's training might offer some hint about where he came from. But aside from the undeniable truth that Duke had been trained for some kind of intense work, we couldn't make out the full story. Who was this man in the pictures? Why had he left Duke behind? And what exactly was Duke's role in whatever work the letter hinted at? "We need to try to find this guy," Jason said one evening after Emma had gone to bed. "If we can locate him, he might be able to fill in the blanks." "But how? There's no name, no address, nothing that points directly to him," I said, holding the letter in my hands. "We could ask around, post online, but it feels like such a long shot." Jason sat back, his brows knit in thought. "It's a long shot, sure. But what other choice do we have? If we don't try, we'll never know." He was right. As much as the mystery gnawed at me, we couldn't just sit on the information and hope the answers would come to us. The next day, I started combing through online forums, local social media groups, and even reaching out to old acquaintances in law enforcement, asking if anyone recognized the man in the photos. Jason did the same on his end, using his connections at work to spread the word. Weeks passed, and we had little to show for our efforts. A few people thought the man looked vaguely familiar, but no one could place him. Our only lead came from a retired police officer who said the training methods described in the notebook sounded like those used by specialized canine units in the military. It wasn't much, but it was something. At least we now had a possible link to the military. "Maybe he was a soldier," Jason speculated one evening, poring over the notebook again. "If that's true, there might be military records we can check." "I don't even know where to begin with that," I said, sighing. "It's not like we can just walk into a base and start asking questions." "No, but there are public records, even veterans organizations," he said. "It might take a while, but if we dig deep enough, We might find something. The idea of sifting through military records felt daunting, but the thought of giving up on finding answers was worse. Over the next several weeks, we devoted every spare moment to our search. I emailed veterans groups, joined forums dedicated to military dog handlers, and posted anonymous inquiries in various online communities. Jason spent hours combing through military-related databases and reaching out to anyone who might have information. Eventually, we got a break. One of the forum members, a former military dog handler, responded to our inquiry. He didn't recognize the man in the photos, but he said the training notes matched techniques used by a particular unit stationed on the East Coast about 5 years ago. It was the closest thing to a solid lead we'd had, and it gave us a place to focus our efforts. We started looking into the unit, searching for anyone who might have served there around the time Duke would have been a puppy. It wasn't easy. Most of the names we came across were unfamiliar, and many of them had common surnames that made tracking them down even harder. But after weeks of searching, we found a name that matched a faintly visible signature in the notebook. Michael Harris. Michael Harris wasn't exactly a rare name, but a little digging revealed that a Michael Harris had indeed served in the unit our forum contact had mentioned. With this information in hand, Jason and I decided it was time to reach out directly. The contact information we found for Michael Harris led to a small town in Virginia. We wrote a letter explaining who we were, what we had found, and why we believed Duke might have once belonged to him. We didn't include too many details, just enough to hopefully pique his interest. Then we waited. A week passed, then 2, then 3. We were starting to lose hope when an envelope appeared in our mailbox. The return address was from Virginia. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter was short and to the point. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I received your letter regarding the dog you call Duke. If he is the dog I think he is, I may have some information that will help you understand his past. Please contact me by phone at your earliest convenience. Best regards, Michael Harris. Jason read the letter over my shoulder, and we immediately went to the kitchen to call the number. My heart was pounding as the phone rang. After a few rings, a man's voice answered. This is Michael Harris. I introduced myself and explained that we had received his letter. He was polite but cautious, asking a few questions about Duke's age, appearance, and behavior. As I described him, his tone softened. Yeah, he said after a long pause. That sounds like him. You've got his scars, his age, and his temperament right. Can you tell us where he came from? Jason asked, his voice steady but urgent. Michael hesitated before answering. Duke, well, we called him Shadow, was part of a training program I was involved in. It was an experimental unit. He was one of several dogs we were working with, but he stood out. Smart, loyal, brave, one of the best we had. What happened? I asked. There was another pause, and I could hear Michael sigh on the other end of the line. The program didn't last long. Politics, funding issues, doesn't matter. When it ended, we were told to return the dogs to their original facilities. But Shadow, I couldn't bring myself to do it. He'd been through so much already, and I didn't trust that he'd have a good life if he went back. So I made a decision. I let him go. Let him go, Jason repeated, clearly puzzled. Michael's voice grew quieter. I knew it wasn't the right thing to do, but I didn't see another option. I left him near that wooded area you mentioned, with food and water, hoping someone would find him and give him a home. I couldn't keep him myself. My situation wouldn't allow it, but I couldn't return him to the facility. I thought I was doing what was best for him. Jason and I exchanged a glance. It wasn't the heroic backstory we had imagined, but it was something. It explained the scar, the training, and how Duke had ended up where he did. "I'm sorry," Michael said after a long silence. "I know it wasn't fair to him. I just didn't know what else to do." "Thank you for telling us," I said. "It means a lot to know more about where he came from." Michael offered to send any additional photos or notes he had, and we thanked him again before ending the call. When we hung up, Jason and I sat quietly, processing everything we had learned. "He really was abandoned," Jason said, his tone heavy. "Not out of malice, but it still doesn't sit right." "Maybe not," I said, looking over at Duke, who was lounging on his bed. "But at least we know the truth now, and knowing what he went through makes me appreciate him even more." Over the next few weeks, Michael sent us a few more photos and documents. The images showed Duke, or Shadow, working through complex training exercises, his focus and determination evident even as a young dog. The documents included more details about the training program, but nothing that changed the core story. Duke had been part of something bigger, something that didn't pan out. And in the end, he had been left to fend for himself. Until he found us. Life gradually returned to normal. Duke continued to thrive, his energy and loyalty undiminished by the revelations about his past. He remained the same loving, protective dog he had always been, and we felt even closer to him now that we knew more about his journey. For Jason and me, the answers we had found brought a sense of closure. There would always be questions we couldn't answer, and some of Michael's decisions still left a bitter taste. But Duke was here, with us, safe and loved. And that was enough. As I watched Duke play with Emma in the yard one afternoon, I couldn't help but smile. His past might have been filled with uncertainty, but his future was clear. He was part of our family, and no amount of mystery or unanswered questions could change that. In the weeks that followed our conversation with Michael Harris, a new sense of curiosity began to grow. Duke, or Shadow, as Michael had once called him, was still the same loving, loyal dog he had always been. But now I saw him through a different lens. I found myself wondering what it must have been like for him, being trained, abandoned, and eventually making his way to us. Each time he ran after Emma in the yard or curled up at the foot of our bed, I couldn't help but think of all he had gone through. I wasn't the only one with questions. Jason, too, had been reflecting on Duke's story. One evening, as we sat on the porch with Duke lying contentedly at our feet, Jason turned to me with a thoughtful look. "Do you think we should try to find out more?" he asked. I glanced down at Duke, who thumped his tail against the wooden boards. "We already know more than we ever thought we would. Isn't that enough?" Jason shrugged. "Maybe. But part of me wants to keep digging. There's something about Michael's story that doesn't sit right. I mean, he abandoned Duke. Yes, it was for what he thought were good reasons. But still, what if there's more to it?" "I don't know," I admitted. Michael gave us as much information as he could. "Do you really think there's anything else out there?" "I think there might be," Jason said. "He mentioned a facility, right? The one he didn't want to send Duke back to. What if we could find that facility? It might give us more insight into what Duke was trained for and why Michael was so reluctant to let him go back." The thought hadn't occurred to me. "You think they'd have records? That they'd even talk to us?" "It's worth a try," Jason said. "At the very least, we could see if it still exists. Maybe it's closed down, but maybe someone who worked there is still around." His determination was contagious. The idea of uncovering more of Duke's past was appealing, even if it was only to satisfy our curiosity. Over the next few days, Jason and I began researching the facility Michael had mentioned. We combed through old training manuals, searched online archives, and even contacted a few military history forums to see if anyone knew of the place. Eventually, we found a name: Horizon Canine Training Facility. It had been a private contract operation working closely with the military for a brief period before it was shut down due to funding cuts and logistical challenges. The more we learned, the clearer it became that the facility had specialized in experimental training programs. They had taken promising young dogs, like Duke, and put them through rigorous exercises designed to enhance their instincts, agility, and problem-solving abilities. The goal, according to a few old press releases we found, was to create dogs capable of working in high-stakes environments, everything from search and rescue missions to covert operations. We also discovered that the facility had closed around the same time Duke had been left near that wooded area. It seemed like more than coincidence. Michael must have known the closure was coming, and instead of handing Duke over to an uncertain fate, he had chosen to give him a chance at a better life. While I still struggled with his decision to abandon Duke, I couldn't ignore the complexity of the situation. Michael had been caught between his duty and his compassion for the animal he had trained. Jason managed to track down a former employee of the facility, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who now ran a small dog training business in a nearby state. We reached out to her via email, explaining who we were and what we had learned about Duke. To our surprise, she replied almost immediately, expressing a willingness to talk. A few days later, we had a phone call with Sarah. She was warm and understanding, and she seemed genuinely interested in Duke's story. "I remember the program well," she said. "It was a unique time, that's for sure. We were working on cutting-edge training methods, but it all fell apart so quickly. Funding dried up, and the whole operation folded before we could really see the results. It was heartbreaking for all of us, who had poured our hearts into the work, and for the dogs, too." "Do you remember Shadow?" Jason asked. "Or Duke, as we call him now." Sarah paused. "Yes, I do. He was an exceptional dog, sharp, brave, and deeply bonded to his handlers. Everyone who worked with him saw his potential. When the facility shut down, there was a lot of uncertainty about where the dogs would go. Some were sent back to their original kennels, others were adopted out. I guess Shadow slipped through the cracks." "Michael told us he didn't want to send Duke back," I said. "He said he didn't trust that he'd have a good life if he returned. Why would that be?" Sarah sighed. "It's complicated. The original kennels were reputable, but they were overwhelmed. When the program ended, they suddenly had more dogs than they knew what to do with. Some of the dogs ended up in overcrowded conditions, and others were sold to organizations that didn't have the same level of care. I think Michael knew that. He probably thought that leaving Shadow in a place where someone might find him and give him a good home was the better option." As we listened to Sarah's account, a clearer picture of Duke's past began to emerge. He had been part of an ambitious project, but when the project failed, the dogs paid the price. Michael's decision, though painful, had been made out of a desire to protect Duke from a potentially worse fate. "Do you know if anyone else from the facility kept track of what happened to the dogs?" Jason asked. "There were a few of us who tried," Sarah said, "but after the closure, it was hard to keep in touch. Most of the handlers moved on to other jobs, and the records were scattered. I've always wondered what happened to some of those dogs. Hearing about Duke, Shadow, makes me feel better, knowing he ended up with a family that loves him." By the time the call ended, we felt both enlightened and humbled. Duke's journey had been more difficult than we could have imagined, but it had ultimately led him to us. I found myself looking at him differently, not with pity, but with a deep respect for everything he had endured and overcome. Life went on, and Duke continued to thrive. He remained a constant presence in our lives, a reminder of resilience and loyalty. The more we learned about his past, the more we cherished him. He wasn't just a dog who had saved our daughter. He was a survivor, a symbol of hope, and a beloved member of our family. Over the next few weeks, Jason and I found ourselves reflecting on what we'd learned from Sarah Mitchell. It was a lot to take in: the specialized training, the facility's closure, and the circumstances that had led Michael Harris to abandon Duke in the first place. The more we thought about it, the more we realized how many unanswered questions still lingered. One Saturday morning, as we sat on the porch sipping our coffee, Jason brought it up again. "Do you think we should reach out to anyone else from that program? Sarah mentioned there were other handlers who tried to keep track of the dogs. Maybe they know something more." I hesitated, not because I didn't want to learn more about Duke's past, but because I wasn't sure where to even begin. "I'm not against the idea," I said slowly, "but it might be hard to track anyone down. Sarah seemed pretty sure that most people moved on after the closure. Do you think it's worth pursuing?" Jason thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I do. Even if we don't find much, it's worth a try. At the very least, we might uncover more about what Duke went through and why Michael felt so strongly about not sending him back." And so, we began our search. It started the same way as before, combing through forums, sending out emails, and posting inquiries in dog training and military-related online communities. Jason and I spent our evenings at the kitchen table with our laptops, sifting through responses and following up on any promising leads. After about 2 weeks, we finally got a hit. One of the forum members pointed us to a man named Rick Thompson, who had worked as a trainer at Horizon Canine Training Facility before its closure. According to the forum member, Rick had stayed in the field and was now running his own training business in Texas. Excited by the possibility of learning more, we reached out to him via email, explaining who we were and why we were trying to piece together Duke's story. To our relief, Rick responded within a few days. His email was short and polite, and he agreed to have a phone call with us. That following weekend, Jason and I dialed the number he had provided, feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness as the phone rang. "Hello?" Rick's voice was warm but firm, with a slight Texan drawl. "This is Rick Thompson." I introduced myself and Jason, explaining how Duke had come into our lives and what we had learned from Michael and Sarah. Rick listened quietly, occasionally asking a question or two. When I finished, he let out a thoughtful hum. "Sounds like you've done a lot of digging," he said. "I remember Shadow, one of the smartest dogs I ever worked with. Hearing what happened to him after the program shut down, I can't say I'm surprised." "You're not surprised Michael left him?" Jason asked, sounding incredulous. Rick sighed. "It's not that I agree with what Michael did, but I understand it. The facility's closure left a lot of us scrambling. We were under pressure to find homes for the dogs, but there weren't many good options. Some of the dogs went back to the original kennels, but like Sarah mentioned, those places were overwhelmed. Others got placed with law enforcement agencies or private security firms, but not every dog was lucky enough to land in the right hands. Shadow, Duke, was one of those dogs who fell through the cracks. Michael must have thought he was doing the best thing he could at the time." "What about the training?" I asked. Sarah told us about the advanced methods the facility was using, but we don't know much beyond that. What kind of work was Duke being prepared for? Rick hesitated before answering. "We were working on a program that combined traditional canine training techniques with newer, experimental approaches. The goal was to create dogs that could think on their feet, their paws, and handle complex situations. They were trained to be more independent, to solve problems without constant handler input. It wasn't just about obedience, it was about adaptability. Shadow excelled at that. I looked at Duke, who was lying on the floor beside me, chewing on one of his favorite toys. It was hard to imagine the carefree dog in front of me once undergoing such rigorous training. Yet at the same time, it made sense. His intelligence and quick reflexes were clear signs of his background. "Why did the program end?" Jason asked. "Funding, politics, internal disagreements, you name it," Rick said with a bitter chuckle. "The whole thing collapsed before it really got off the ground. Once it was over, we were left trying to pick up the pieces. Most of us moved on to other jobs. I stayed in the field, but others left training altogether. It was a shame because the dogs we worked with were truly remarkable." "And the facility itself?" I asked. "What happened to it?" "It was shut down and eventually sold off. As far as I know, the building's been repurposed for something else. The records were scattered, and any equipment or supplies were auctioned off. It's not like there's a central database where you can look up what happened to the dogs. Each of us just did the best we could to find them homes." Rick's words painted a picture of a program that had held so much promise, but had ultimately faltered under the weight of bureaucracy and logistical challenges. As much as I wanted to be angry at Michael for abandoning Duke, I was starting to understand the difficult position he had been in. The entire system had failed, leaving both the dogs and their handlers in a precarious situation. By the end of the call, we thanked Rick for his time and insight. He offered to send us a few old training notes he still had on hand, as well as some photographs from the facility's early days. We gratefully accepted and waited eagerly for his email to arrive. When it did, we found ourselves poring over the materials late into the night. The photographs showed young, eager-looking dogs being put through various drills, running obstacle courses, searching for hidden objects, and practicing advanced commands. In one of the photos, we spotted Duke, his ears perked and his eyes sharp as he worked alongside a handler. It was both heartwarming and bittersweet to see him in his element, excelling at the tasks he had been trained for. The training notes were equally fascinating. They outlined the methods the handlers had used to teach the dogs to think critically and respond to dynamic situations. It was clear that a lot of thought and care had gone into the program, even if it hadn't lasted. Reading through the notes, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in Duke's abilities. He wasn't just a good dog, he was extraordinary. In the days that followed, Jason and I often talked about what we had learned. We tried to piece together the puzzle of Duke's past, filling in the gaps with the information we now had. Each new detail made his story all the more remarkable. He had gone from being a highly trained, highly capable working dog to a beloved family pet. It was a journey we couldn't have imagined when he first came into our lives. As we continued to learn more, we also found ourselves appreciating Duke even more. Knowing what he had been through, and what he was capable of, gave us a deeper bond with him. He wasn't just our loyal companion, he was a survivor, a testament to resilience and adaptability. And yet, even with all the new information, there was still more to uncover. Rick had mentioned other handlers and other dogs from the program. If we could track down more of them, perhaps we could fill in the remaining blanks. The idea excited me, but it also made me realize how far we had already come. When we first found that scar on Duke's side, we had no idea where the journey would lead. Now, we had a richer understanding of the dog who had saved our family and become an irreplaceable part of our lives. Duke, for his part, seemed oblivious to all the research and reflection. He continued to greet each day with boundless enthusiasm, chasing squirrels in the yard, playing with Emma, and curling up beside us at night. His joy was a reminder that, no matter what his past had been, he was happy now. And that, more than anything, was what truly mattered. As we gathered more pieces of Duke's story, I found myself increasingly amazed by the strength and resilience he must have had to endure everything. The more Jason and I delved into his background, the more layers we uncovered. The threads were starting to weave together a picture that was both inspiring and humbling. One morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, leafing through the training notes that Rick had sent us. Duke was sprawled out nearby, his tail thumping lazily against the floor as he dozed. The notes were meticulous. Each entry detailed the drills the dogs were put through, the progress they made, and the qualities that stood out. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as I read the observations about Duke, or Shadow, as he was known then. Exceptional problem-solving skills, one entry noted. Quick learner, strong drive to please, a natural leader among the other dogs. It was clear that Duke had always been special. He had thrived in an environment that demanded intelligence and adaptability, and now, as I watched him sleeping peacefully, I felt grateful that he had found his way to us. But at the same time, I couldn't stop wondering what might have been if his program hadn't been shut down. What role might he have played? What kind of missions would he have been sent on? And most importantly, who had trained him to be this remarkable dog? Later that day, Jason and I talked about our next steps. We knew we had come a long way since we first discovered the scar and began our search for answers, but we also knew there was still more to uncover. "We've got a lot of pieces now," Jason said, sitting down beside me and pulling the training notes closer. "But I still feel like there's a missing link. There are gaps in the timeline. We know Duke was trained at Horizon, but we don't know much about the time leading up to that, or how he ended up there in the first place." I nodded. "And we don't know who originally selected him for the program. Someone must have seen his potential as a puppy. I wonder if that person is still around, or if there are records from the breeding kennel where he was born." It was a long shot, but it was the only lead we had. That evening, we began searching for any mention of the kennels that had supplied dogs to Horizon. We scoured online forums, old articles, and archived pages from the facility's early days. After several hours of searching, we finally found a clue. A brief mention of a kennel called Blue Ridge Shepherds. According to an old news article about Horizon's launch, Blue Ridge was one of the key suppliers of German Shepherds for the program. The next step was finding out if Blue Ridge still existed. A quick online search revealed that the kennel was still in operation, located just a few hours' drive from us. We decided to reach out and see if they had any records of Duke's early days. The following morning, I made the call. The woman who answered introduced herself as Karen, the kennel's current owner. I explained who we were and what we were trying to find out. To my surprise, Karen remembered the program at Horizon and was more than willing to help. "I'll have to dig through some old files," she said. "But if he came from here, we should have a record. Give me a day or two, and I'll get back to you." True to her word, Karen called back a couple of days later with good news. She had found the records for a litter born around the time Duke would have been a puppy. She confirmed that one of the pups had been sent to Horizon and matched the description we had provided. "We didn't name them individually back then," Karen said, "but we did keep track of their temperament tests. The puppy that went to Horizon was one of the strongest and most confident in the litter. Even as a tiny pup, he stood out." Hearing this made me smile. Even as a baby, Duke had been exceptional. Karen went on to explain that the litter had come from a line of working dogs known for their intelligence and athleticism. She offered to send us the puppy's records, along with photos of his parents, so we could learn more about his lineage. When the documents arrived in the mail, Jason and I eagerly spread them out on the table. The photos showed two beautiful German shepherds. Duke's mother, a sleek, dark-coated female with a calm and steady expression, and his father, a larger, more rugged male with a confident stance. The records detailed their backgrounds, highlighting their impressive pedigrees and strong working instincts. It was fascinating to see where Duke's incredible abilities had come from. His parents' traits, intelligence, loyalty, drive, had clearly been passed down to him. And yet Duke's journey had taken him far beyond his breeding. He had faced challenges and uncertainties that most dogs never would, and he had come through it all stronger and more loving than ever. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed a small note in the margin of one of the records. It was handwritten, faint, and almost easy to miss. It simply read, "Selected for advanced training, Horizon program, potential candidate for leadership roles." "Look at this," I said, pointing it out to Jason. He leaned over and read the note. "So someone specifically picked him out from the start," he said. "That explains why he ended up in the program. They must have seen something in him right away." "It makes me wonder who wrote that," I said. "Maybe it was someone who worked closely with the program, someone who recognized his potential." "Do you think we could find out who wrote it?" Jason asked. It was a good question, but one without an immediate answer. Still, it gave us another lead to follow. If we could identify the person who had first chosen Duke for the program, we might gain even more insight into his early days and the training he underwent. Over the next few weeks, we reached out to a few more contacts, including former Horizon staff and even Karen at Blue Ridge. While no one could confirm who had written the note, we did learn more about the selection process. The dogs chosen for Horizon were carefully evaluated by a team of experienced handlers and trainers. They looked for traits like confidence, problem-solving ability, and a natural willingness to work alongside people. Duke had been a standout from the beginning, and that note in the margin was a testament to his potential. With each new piece of information, Jason and I felt a deeper connection to Duke's story. We had started this journey simply wanting to know where he came from and why he had a scar on his side. Now, we understood so much more. We knew about his extraordinary lineage, his advanced training, and the difficult decisions that had shaped his life. And through it all, we had come to appreciate Duke not just as a loyal companion, but as a truly remarkable dog who had overcome so much to find his place in our family. Despite the answers we had uncovered, there was still more we wanted to know. The note in the margin hinted at someone who had seen something special in Duke, someone who might have played a pivotal role in his journey. Finding that person became our next goal, not just to satisfy our curiosity, but to fully understand the path that had led Duke to us. With each passing day, Duke's presence continued to fill our home with warmth and joy. I often found myself marveling at how far we had come in understanding his journey. From those early days when we didn't even know the origins of his scar, to now, piecing together his story, learning about the program he had been a part of, and meeting the people who had shaped his early life. Still, I felt a nagging sense of curiosity about the name we'd seen in the margin of the records from Blue Ridge Shepherds. Who had recognized Duke's potential so early on, and what had led them to make that note? Jason shared my curiosity, and on weekends we dedicated time to furthering our search. We scoured old documents, sent inquiries to former staff members from Horizon, and even reached out again to Karen at Blue Ridge to see if she could remember who might have written that note. Karen was helpful, but she admitted that the records were so old and the staff had changed so much over the years that she couldn't say for sure who had written it. "It's been so long," Karen said over the phone. "I wish I could help more, but back then, it wasn't uncommon for multiple handlers to review the puppies before making a final selection. The note could have been from one of the senior trainers, or even someone brought in as a consultant. There just aren't any additional records that I'm aware of." Her answer wasn't what we had hoped for, but it didn't deter us. Instead, we shifted our focus. If the name wasn't listed in Blue Ridge's records, perhaps it existed somewhere in Horizon's archives. Though the facility had been closed for years, we knew that some of its former staff members had kept personal copies of training notes and reports. Reaching out to them felt like the logical next step. The process was slow. Many of the people we contacted either didn't respond or no longer had any of the records we were looking for. A few replied with kind words, expressing gratitude that Duke, or Shadow as they remembered him, had found a loving home. Some mentioned how exceptional he had been, even as a young dog, reinforcing what we already knew. Yet none of them could point us toward the person who had written that note. It wasn't until several weeks into our search that we received a promising lead. A former handler named Mark Jensen, who had worked briefly with Horizon before its closure, responded to one of our emails. He remembered Shadow clearly and seemed genuinely excited to talk. When we spoke to him on the phone, his recollection of those days was vivid. "Shadow was one of the best dogs I ever trained," Mark said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Even as a puppy, he had that it factor. I wasn't the one who picked him initially. That decision was made before I joined the team. But I worked with him once he was there. He was incredible. Focused, driven, and incredibly smart." "Do you know who made the initial selection?" Jason asked. Mark paused for a moment. "I can't say for certain, but I do remember hearing that one of the senior trainers had gone out to Blue Ridge specifically to evaluate the litter. They came back talking about this one puppy that stood out, said he had a confidence and intelligence that were rare even among top-tier working lines. I think it might have been a guy named Alan Decker." "Alan Decker?" I repeated, quickly jotting down the name. "Yeah," Mark said. "He was a consultant for the program. Didn't stay with Horizon long, but he was known for having a good eye for dogs. If he's the one who made that note, it wouldn't surprise me. He was the kind of person who could look at a puppy and see what they'd become years down the line." This was the most concrete lead we'd had in weeks. Thanking Mark for his time, we promised to follow up if we had more questions. Once we hung up, Jason and I immediately started researching Alan Decker. The name wasn't entirely uncommon, but after narrowing down the search to those involved in canine training or consulting, we found a few references to a trainer who had worked on government contracts and specialized in advanced canine selection methods. Alan Decker was a name that appeared in a handful of old training manuals and industry publications. His reputation, as far as we could tell, was stellar. He was known for his ability to identify and nurture exceptional dogs, and he had worked with several high-profile programs before retiring from the field. One article mentioned that he had been instrumental in developing selection criteria for a now-defunct government project, which lined up with what we knew about Horizon's ties to experimental training methods. After a bit more digging, we found an address and phone number for Alan Decker, though we weren't sure if the information was still current. With some trepidation, Jason made the call. The line rang several times before a voice answered. "This is Alan." Jason introduced himself and explained why we were calling. Alan's tone was cautious at first, but as Jason described Duke and the details we had uncovered, his demeanor shifted. "I remember that puppy," Alan said, his voice softening. "I didn't know what happened to him after the program shut down, but it's good to hear he ended up in a good home." "Did you write the note in the margin of the Blue Ridge records?" Jason asked. "Yes," Alan said after a pause. "I wrote that. He was one of the best I'd ever seen. I knew he had the potential to do great things, which is why I recommended him for Horizon. I didn't think anyone would ever see that note again." Hearing his confirmation felt like a breakthrough. This was the person who had first seen the spark in Duke, the one who had recognized his exceptional qualities long before anyone else. As we spoke with Alan, he shared his memories of evaluating the litter at Blue Ridge. He described how Duke, then just a tiny, energetic pup, had stood out from the moment he set eyes on him. Alan recounted how Duke had approached him fearlessly, eager to engage and quick to learn even the simplest commands. "He was special," Alan said. "I've worked with hundreds of dogs over the years, but there are a few you never forget. He was one of them. It's good to know he's still doing well." By the end of the conversation, Jason and I felt a sense of closure we hadn't expected. We had found the person who had set Duke's journey in motion, the one who had seen his potential and given him a chance to shine. And while Alan didn't have many additional records or details about Duke's training, his memories added another layer to the story we were piecing together. When we hung up, I looked over at Duke, who was lying on his bed, chewing contentedly on a bone. He had no idea how many people had played a role in his life, how many decisions and chance encounters had led him to where he was now. But Jason and I knew, and that knowledge made his presence in our lives feel all the more meaningful. Though we had finally identified the author of the note, we weren't done yet. Alan's insight had given us another perspective on Duke's early days, but there were still unanswered questions about the program's closure and what had happened to the other dogs. With renewed determination, we decided to keep searching, knowing that every new detail we uncovered would deepen our understanding of the incredible dog who had come into our lives and changed them forever. As the months went by, the journey we'd embarked upon, the search for Duke's origins, his training, and the people who had shaped his early life, finally felt complete. We'd followed every lead, spoken to former handlers, and connected with the very person who had first recognized Duke's potential as a puppy. Each conversation had brought new insights, new layers to a story that was already extraordinary. And through it all, Duke had remained his loyal, loving self. One cool spring afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching Emma and Duke playing in the yard. She had grown so much since that fateful day when Duke had stepped in to save her. Back then, he'd been our family's guardian angel, appearing out of nowhere to shield her from danger. Now, he was her constant companion, her playmate, and her protector. As I sat there, I thought back to all the people who had been a part of Duke's story. Michael Harris, who had made the difficult decision to let him go. Sarah Mitchell and Rick Thompson, who had shared their memories and training records. Karen from Blue Ridge Shepherds, who had helped us trace his lineage. And finally, Alan Decker, who had seen something remarkable in him, even as a tiny puppy. Each of them had played a role in shaping the dog who now trotted happily through the grass, chasing a ball and wagging his tail. I thought about the lessons Duke had taught me along the way. Lessons about resilience, loyalty, and the power of second chances. He had faced uncertainty and change, yet he had come through it all with an open heart, ready to love and protect his new family. His story was a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't seek recognition, the ones who quietly do their part and keep moving forward. Jason joined me on the porch, carrying a glass of iced tea. He sat down beside me and followed my gaze. "They make quite the pair, don't they?" he said with a smile, nodding toward Emma and Duke. "They do," I agreed. "I can't imagine life without him." Jason leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I think this whole experience, learning about Duke's past, meeting all those people, has made me appreciate him even more. He's not just a great dog. He's part of our family." I nodded. "He's more than that. He's a reminder of how lucky we are. All those twists and turns in his life, all the challenges he faced, it all led him here. To us." Duke paused in his game, trotting back toward us with the ball in his mouth. He dropped it at Jason's feet and looked up expectantly, his tail wagging furiously. Jason laughed, reaching down to scratch behind Duke's ears. "Good boy," he said. "You're the best." And he was. In every way that mattered, Duke had brought something special to our lives. His story, while full of ups and downs, was ultimately one of hope and resilience. He had found his way home, and in doing so, he had given us something we never knew we needed. A reminder of how much love and joy a dog can bring, even after the most difficult of beginnings. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the yard, I felt a deep sense of peace. Our journey to uncover Duke's past was over, but his place in our family was as strong as ever. He had come into our lives as a guardian, stayed as a friend, and would always be, in every sense, part of our home. As Jason and I sat there, I couldn't help but recall one particular conversation we'd had with Alan Decker, the man who had seen Duke's potential all those years ago. He had told us about the day he first met Duke at the Blue Ridge Shepherd's Kennel, how Duke, then just a tiny, energetic puppy, had walked right up to him and stared at him with those keen, intelligent eyes. Alan said he'd known in that moment that this dog was different, that he had a spark that was rare even among the best working lines. "That pup had the heart of a lion," Alan had said, his voice filled with admiration. "I'm not surprised to hear he's still protecting the people he loves." It was that heart, that strength and loyalty, that had carried Duke through every chapter of his journey. As I watched him now, his tail wagging and his tongue lolling out happily, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Duke had given us so much more than we had ever expected. A reason to smile, a sense of security, and a reminder that even the most uncertain paths can lead to the most incredible destinations. Emma ran over, her laughter filling the air as she wrapped her arms around Duke's neck. "You're my best friend, Duke," she said, kissing the top of his head. Duke responded with a happy bark, his eyes shining with pure joy. Jason reached over and took my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I think we're the lucky ones," he said quietly, and I couldn't have agreed more. As the day faded into evening, we sat together on that porch, feeling the warmth of the sun's final rays and the even greater warmth of the family we had built, one that now, and always, included Duke.